Hello, and a warm welcome to the Whispered Lore. As you settle in, allow the world outside to gently fade. Tonight, our journey takes us back to the medieval world to explore a process of creation that unfolded not over years, but over lifetimes. We will be looking at the quiet miracle of the Gothic Cathedral. Join me as we trace the story from its very beginnings in the stone quarry, listening for the distant echo of the chisel. We will explore the patient collaboration of the guilds, the meaning of a single mason's mark, and the slow, deliberate finance that funded these monumental acts of faith and artistry. There is no hurry here. Simply the story of stone, skill, and time unfurling at its own natural pace. We now turn our attention from the quarry face and the banker mason's bench to the grand design itself, the theological and engineering impetus that demanded such a prodigious expenditure of material, labor, and time. This is the story of the Gothic ambition, an aspiration to transform stone from a medium of compressive, earthbound strength into a skeletal framework for light and air, to build a forest of stone that reached, quite literally, towards the heavens. The preceding Romanesque period was characterized by a profound sense of mass. Its churches were fortresses of God, with thick, solid walls, massive piers, and heavy barrel or groin vaults. These structures were dark, their interiors punctuated by relatively small, deep-set windows, a necessary consequence of walls that had to bear the entirety of the roof's immense weight and the outward thrust of the rounded arches. The aesthetic was one of solemn, subterranean permanence. The spiritual experience was grounded, enclosed, and protected from the world outside. The Gothic impulse was a radical departure. It sought not enclosure, but elevation, not darkness, but divine light, or lux nova. This was a theological imperative articulated by figures like Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis in the mid-12th century, who saw light as the most direct physical manifestation of God. To flood the sacred space with colored light, filtered through vast stained glass windows, was to create a tangible representation of the celestial Jerusalem on earth. But to do so required a fundamental rethinking of structural engineering. It required the dematerialization of the wall. The solution was not a single invention, but a synthesis of three interconnected structural elements: the pointed arch, the ribbed vault, and the flying buttress. Together, they formed a revolutionary system that redirected the forces of gravity with a newfound elegance and efficiency, allowing structures to soar to heights previously unimaginable. Let us first consider the pointed arch. The Romanesque semicircular arch, for all its classical harmony, possessed a significant structural limitation. The forces it transmitted from the load above pushed outwards as much as they pushed downwards. This lateral thrust required an immense mass of masonry in the walls and piers to resist it. The pointed arch, by contrast, is more vertically inclined. It channels the weight of the structure above it in a more downward direction, significantly reducing the outward bursting force. This simple change in geometry was profound. It meant that the arch could span wider gaps and be raised to greater heights with less stress on the supporting members. Visually, its form inherently draws the eye upward, reinforcing the verticality that was so central to the Gothic aesthetic. The pointed arch was the foundational element, but its full potential was unlocked by its application in the ribbed vault. The Romanesque groin vault was formed by the intersection of two barrel vaults, creating a heavy, solid, and cumbersome ceiling. The Gothic ribbed vault, however, separated the structural skeleton from the surface skin. First, a framework of slender, arched stone ribs, the ogives, was constructed. This framework consisted of transverse ribs, which spanned the width of the bay, and two diagonal ribs, which crossed the bay from corner to corner. These ribs were meticulously cut, with each individual stone, or voussoir, shaped to a precise template. They were erected upon a temporary wooden framework known as centering. At the apex where the ribs met, a central keystone, or boss, often intricately carved, was inserted, locking the entire framework into a state of stable compression. Only after this stone skeleton was in place were the spaces between the ribs, the 4 or 6 triangular-shaped panels known as the webbing, filled in. The transition from the Romanesque to the Gothic represents one of the most significant architectural and engineering shifts in Western history. The preceding style, with its massive, earth-bound forms, its thick, solid walls, and its small, deeply splayed windows, conveyed a sense of fortress-like security, a bulwark against a chaotic world. Its primary structural components were the semicircular arch and the immensely heavy barrel vault, or the slightly more complex groin vault. These structures, while robust, generated immense outward or lateral thrust. To counteract this pressure, the walls had to be extraordinarily thick, leaving little room for fenestration. The interior spaces, consequently, were often dark, segmented, and horizontally oriented. The ambition of the Gothic builders was fundamentally different. It was a theological ambition translated into stone and glass. To build taller, to reach closer to the heavens, and to dissolve the heavy masonry walls, replacing them with a luminous tapestry of colored light. This was not merely a decorative choice. It was an attempt to create a terrestrial manifestation of the celestial Jerusalem, a space defined not by mass, but by light itself. This chapter explores the interlocking set of structural innovations that made this divine blueprint possible, an engineering system of profound elegance and daring that allowed for the dematerialization of the cathedral wall. The journey towards light and height begins with the most fundamental element of the system, the pointed arch. The Romanesque builders relied almost exclusively on the semicircular, or Roman, arch. While strong, its geometry is fixed. The height of a semicircular arch is always exactly half of its span. This geometric rigidity created significant problems, particularly when vaulting rectangular rather than perfectly square bays. Furthermore, the forces within a semicircular arch are directed outwards along its curve, pushing against its supports with considerable lateral thrust. This is the primary reason Romanesque walls needed such immense thickness. The pointed arch, likely borrowed and refined from Islamic architecture, offered a revolutionary solution. Its key advantage is its structural and geometric flexibility. By bringing the two sides of the arch to a point at the apex, the load of the masonry above is channeled in a much more vertical direction. The downward forces are significantly greater than the outward forces. This reduced lateral thrust meant that the supporting walls or piers did not need to be as massive to prevent them from being pushed apart. The structure could therefore be built higher and with more slender supports. A pointed arch can be made narrow and tall, or wide and shallow, all while reaching the same height. This adaptability was crucial for vaulting the oblong bays of a cathedral's nave, allowing for a uniform ceiling height even when the length and width of the vaulted compartments varied. The pointed arch is the foundational principle, the essential geometric key that unlocks the potential for the entire Gothic system. Building upon the principle of the pointed arch, the master masons developed the ribbed vault. This was a radical departure from the heavy, monolithic barrel and groin vaults of the Romanesque. The ribbed vault can be understood as a skeletal structure. The masons would first construct a framework of arches or ribs, spanning the bay diagonally, transversely, and longitudinally. These ribs were comprised of carefully cut stones, known as voussoirs. They were erected upon temporary wooden support structures called centering. At the central intersection point of the diagonal ribs, a precisely carved boss stone, or keystone, was placed, locking the ribs together under compression. Once this stone skeleton was in place and the mortar had set, the masons could fill in the triangular panels between the ribs, known as the webbing. The great work of a cathedral does not begin with the ceremonial laying of a foundation stone. It does not begin with the architect's parchment, nor with the chapter's decision to build. It begins, rather, in silence and solitude, perhaps years before, in a nameless field or on a wooded escarpment, with a man walking slowly, his gaze directed not towards the heavens, but down at the earth beneath his feet. This is the search for the stone, the primordial act of cathedral construction upon which all subsequent glories will depend. The selection of a quarry was not a matter of convenience, but the primary determinant of a project's scale, its aesthetic character, and its very longevity. A poor choice of stone, one that fractured unpredictably, or weathered poorly, or was simply too costly to transport, could doom a construction campaign before the first course of masonry was ever laid. The man charged with this task was often the master mason himself, or a trusted specialist, a quarry master, whose skills were as vital as those of any carver or engineer. His was a craft of profound observation, a deep and practical geology learned not from books, but from a lifetime of tactile engagement with the material. He was, in essence, reading the land. His search was a slow, methodical process of elimination, guided by a complex matrix of visual, auditory, and physical cues. He would begin by studying the topography. A sheer cliff face or an exposed river gorge was an obvious starting point, a place where the earth had conveniently done the work of excavation, revealing its strata-like pages in a book. But more often, the signs were subtle. He would look for a gentle, persistent slope on a hillside. A sharp, uniform gradient could indicate a solid, underlying bed of rock, shedding the looser topsoil, or overburden at a consistent rate. A landscape of lumpy, irregular hillocks might suggest a less reliable geology, a mix of soft clays and fragmented, untrustworthy stone. The vegetation itself was a text to be read. Certain types of trees and wildflowers thrive in the thin, alkaline soils that form above limestone, while others prefer the acidic conditions over sandstone or granite. The mason would note the quality of the timber. An area of stunted, gnarled trees might signal that the bedrock was very close to the surface, reducing the amount of overburden that would need to be cleared, a significant saving in labor. Conversely, a forest of tall, deep-rooted oaks suggested a deep and heavy layer of topsoil that could make accessing the stone prohibitively expensive. Water was another critical informant. The mason would follow streams and gullies, observing the pebbles and silt in their beds. These were samples, carried from further upstream, offering clues to the geology of the higher ground. A stream running clear and fast over a solid rock bed was a promising sign. The presence of a spring, or a line of seepages halfway up a hill, could indicate a permeable layer of earth sitting atop a solid, impermeable bed of stone, the very layer he was seeking. He would observe how rainwater behaved after a storm. Did it pool on the surface, suggesting dense, non-porous clay, or did it drain away quickly, hinting at a fractured, porous subsurface, or perhaps the clean, well-drained surface of a solid rock shelf? Having identified a promising area through these broad, landscape-scale observations, the work became more intimate and laborious. The next stage was the digging of prospect pits. These were not yet a quarry, but small, exploratory trenches, perhaps only a few feet square, dug by hand with pick and shovel. The purpose was twofold. First, to measure the depth of the overburden. The ideal quarry had a thin layer of soil and loose, decomposed rock, the ridding layer, which could be stripped away with relative ease. A layer more than a few feet thick dramatically increased the initial cost of opening the quarry. The soaring vaults of a Gothic cathedral, reaching toward the heavens, seem to defy the very material from which they are made. They appear weightless, ethereal, a testament to faith rendered in stone. But this final, transcendent form begins in a place of profound earthiness, of immense weight and brute force. It begins in the quarry. This is the story of the first act of creation, the transformation of inert bedrock into a potential building block, a process governed by geology, geometry, and immense human effort. The selection of a quarry was the first and perhaps most critical decision in the centuries-long life of a cathedral project. It was a choice dictated not by divine inspiration, but by the unforgiving realities of logistics and geology. proximity was paramount. The transport of stone was an enterprise of almost unimaginable difficulty and expense. An ideal quarry lay near a navigable river. For water transport, even against the current, was exponentially more efficient than overland hauling. A single barge could carry the load of dozens of ox carts, gliding over water rather than grinding along rudimentary roads. If a river was not available, the master builder would survey the land for the most direct, most level route possible. Hills, marshes, and dense forests were not mere obstacles. They were catastrophic impediments to the flow of material, adding years and incalculable cost to the construction. But proximity was meaningless if the stone itself was unsuitable. The master mason, a man whose expertise was as much geological as it was architectural, would spend weeks, sometimes months, prospecting for the perfect stone. He sought what was known as freestone, a fine-grained sedimentary rock, typically limestone or sandstone, with no pronounced grain or bedding planes. This quality was essential. It meant the stone could be worked, or freed, in any direction with equal ease, allowing for the intricate carvings, delicate tracery, and precisely cut voussoirs that defined the Gothic style. He would examine the outcroppings, noting the color, the texture, and the way the stone weathered. He might even order small test blocks to be cut and exposed to the elements for a season, observing how they fared against the local rain, wind, and frost. The stone's lithology had to be intimately understood. A stone too soft would crumble under the immense compressive forces of the structure. A stone too hard would resist the carver's chisel and rapidly dull the mason's precious iron tools. Once a suitable site was identified and the rights to it secured, often through complex negotiations with a local lord or monastic order, the work of opening the quarry could begin. The first task was the removal of the overburden, the layers of topsoil, clay, and inferior weathered rock that concealed the quality stone beneath. This was a task of pure, undifferentiated labor, carried out by the lowest tier of workers using simple shovels, picks, and baskets. For every usable block extracted, tons of this unwanted material had to be laboriously dug out and carted away, creating vast spoil heaps that would, over centuries, become grass-covered hillocks, the only surface clue to the immense void left behind. With the rock face exposed, the true quarrying began. The master quarryman would survey the face, his experienced eye reading the subtle, almost invisible lines of fissure and cleavage within the stone. He was not simply attacking the rock, he was collaborating with its inherent structure. He would mark out the dimensions of the desired block directly onto the rock face using charcoal or a metal scriber, a process known as laying out. These initial blocks were always cut larger than their final intended dimensions, an allowance for the shaping process and any potential damage during transport. The extraction itself was a slow, rhythmic, and incredibly precise process. The primary tools were simple, but effective. The completed cathedral stands as a testament to faith, an articulation of divine geometry in stone and glass. But to comprehend its creation, we must look away from the finished spires and the vaulted ceilings. We must look down, to the earth, and to the water. We must understand that before it was a house of God, the cathedral was a project of immense, almost unimaginable logistical complexity. It was a slow, deliberate conquest of distance and gravity, a symphony of coordinated effort played out over generations. This is the story of that effort, the story of the rivers of stone, the journey of every single ashlar, every voussoir, every delicate piece of tracery, begins in the quiet violence of the quarry. Here, far from the bustling town where the cathedral will rise, the world is reduced to rock and dust, to the percussive ring of iron on stone, a sound that has changed little over millennia. The quarry master, the Magister Lapidarius, does not simply command the breaking of rock. He reads it. He understands its bedding planes, the layers laid down by ancient seas. He can tap a stone face with a hammer and, from the resonance, discern its integrity, listening for the clear, solid ring that denotes a stone free of hidden faults or fissures, a stone worthy of the great work. Once a suitable seam is identified, the process of extraction begins. This is not a matter of high explosives or powerful machinery. It is a patient, methodical process. Quarrymen, using iron wedges, picks, and heavy mauls, cut deep channels into the rock face. They exploit natural joints in the stone where they can. Into these channels they drive a series of dry wooden wedges. Water is then poured over the wedges. Over hours or even days, the wood slowly, inexorably swells. The pressure it exerts is immense, a silent, powerful force that grows within the stone itself. Eventually, with a deep groan, a sound like the earth shifting in its sleep, a massive block separates from the bedrock. This raw block, weighing many tons, is still far too cumbersome and heavy for efficient transport. To move it in this state would be a colossal waste of effort and resources. And so, the first stage of refinement occurs here, at the quarry's edge, in a process known as épinalage, or rough dressing. Masons, distinct from the quarrymen, descend upon the block. With heavy axes and hammers, they begin the work of squaring the stone, removing the roughest imperfections and the excess mass. They are not creating a finished piece, they are merely creating a more regular, manageable shape, a cuboid that approximates the final dimensions required. This process can reduce the stone's weight by as much as a third, a critical saving in the economy of animal and human labor that will define its journey. Each roughly dressed block is then marked, incised with a simple symbol, a quarry mark, or a destination code, a piece of administrative data carved into its very surface. This mark allows the clerk of the works, miles away at the construction site, to track its origin and its payment. Now, the first true test of logistics begins. Moving the stone from the quarry face to a navigable river, or a major road, this initial land-based transit is often the most arduous part of the entire journey. The terrain is frequently uneven, the distance is short but challenging. For this, the builders rely on the oldest of technologies, brute force, leverage, and friction management. The great blocks are levered onto timber sledges. These are not wheeled carts, but simple, massive platforms of hewn logs, designed to be dragged. Teams of oxen, sometimes a dozen or more yoked together, strain against their harnesses. The air is filled with the lowing of the animals and the shouts of the teamsters. Under the runners of the sledge, men place wooden rollers, leapfrogging them from back to front as the sledge inches forward. The immense skeletal forms of the Gothic cathedrals did not rise from the earth through disorganized effort. The sheer scale of such an undertaking, the logistical complexity of quarrying, transporting, and dressing tens of thousands of tons of stone, demanded a new form of human organization. The ad hoc labor gangs of the earlier Romanesque period were insufficient for projects that would span not years, but generations. What was required was a system, a structure capable of preserving knowledge, enforcing standards, and marshaling human skill over the course of a century or more. This structure was the guild. The rise of the guilds in the High Middle Ages represents the formal organization of an army of artisans, a disciplined force without which the Gothic efflorescence would have been impossible. The origins of these bodies are deeply rooted in the social and economic soil of a changing Europe. They were not a sudden invention, but an evolution from earlier forms of association. One can see their antecedents in the Roman collegia, which were voluntary associations of craftsmen in a single trade, organized for both social and religious purposes. Following the collapse of Roman authority, these formal structures largely vanished, but the impulse toward mutual association did not. Throughout the early medieval period, lay fraternities and religious confraternities provided a framework for communal support, offering prayers for the dead and aid to members in times of hardship. As towns and cities began to re-emerge and grow from the 11th century onward, these older social religious models began to merge with the practical necessities of burgeoning trade. Craftsmen, migrating to these new urban centers, began to group together not only for fellowship, but for the protection and regulation of their specific trade, their mysterium, or mystery. For the stonemason, this formalization was particularly crucial. Unlike a weaver or a baker whose work was contained within a small urban workshop, the master mason was an itinerant professional, following the great construction projects from town to town. A cathedral project was the largest, most complex, and most prestigious undertaking of its age. To manage the hundreds of workers on such a site, a clear and rigid hierarchy was essential. The guild provided this hierarchy, a structured path from raw youth to accomplished master. The journey began with the apprentice. A boy, often as young as 10 or 12, would be formally indentured to a master mason. This was a legally binding contract, a document that would define the next 7 to 10 years of his life. The apprentice would leave his own family and move into the household of his master, becoming, in effect, a member of the master's family, subject to his discipline and authority. He received no wages. His payment was his keep, a place to sleep, often in the workshop itself, food at the master's table, and, most importantly, the gradual impartation of the skills of the craft. His initial years were spent in relentless, repetitive, and menial labor. He was the workshop's engine. He would mix vast quantities of mortar, a precise and physically demanding task involving the slaking of lime and the mixing of sand and water to a specific consistency. He would sharpen the tools of the masters and journeymen, spending countless hours at the grinding wheel, learning the precise angle required for each type of chisel, for the claw and the drove and the point. He would be responsible for carrying templates, moving smaller blocks of stone, and cleaning the workshop floor of the ever-present stone dust and chippings. These were not merely chores. They were the first, most fundamental lessons in the properties of his material and the logic of the workshop. Through this rote labor, he absorbed the rhythm of the work, the language of the craft, and the unwritten rules of the construction site. In the complex and interwoven hierarchy of the medieval construction site, one figure stands apart, a fulcrum upon which the entire colossal enterprise balanced. This was the master mason. His title, in its simple utility, belies the immense scope of his responsibilities, for he was not merely the most skilled craftsman on site. He was the living repository of architectural knowledge, the practical engineer of unprecedented structures, and the quiet visionary who held in his mind's eye the finished form of a building that would take generations to complete. To understand the construction of a Gothic cathedral is to understand the mind and the methods of the master mason. His role began not at the quarry, nor with the laying of the first foundation stone, but in a quiet, dedicated space known as the tracing house, or tracing floor. Here, on a vast, smooth surface of plaster of Paris, laid meticulously over a bed of stone or timber, the cathedral was born in its two-dimensional form. This floor was the master mason's primary drawing board, a full-scale canvas upon which the most intricate elements of the structure would be delineated. Armed with his essential tools, the straight edge, the square, and the compass, he would work for hours, sometimes days, incising the clean, white surface with the lines that would become stone. The geometry he employed was not the abstract algebra of a later age, but a practical, applied system rooted in the classical traditions of Euclid. The secrets of the craft were geometric secrets. The principle of ad quadratum, or generation from the square, and ad triangulum, generation from the equilateral triangle, formed the basis of nearly every design decision. By rotating a square within a circle, or by constructing a series of interlocking triangles, the master mason could derive the precise proportions for a pier, the elegant curvature of a rib vault, or the complex, branching patterns of window tracery. He would begin, perhaps, with a single baseline, and from it, with only his compass and rule, generate the entire cross-section of the nave, ensuring that every part related harmonically to the whole. The process was silent, deliberate, a meditation in line and form. The scratch of the iron point on the plaster was the first articulation of a vision that would eventually soar hundreds of feet into the air. From these full-scale drawings, the second stage of the architect's work would commence. Wooden templates, or molds, were painstakingly created, capturing the exact curve of a vault rib, the specific angle of a voussoir for an arch, or the delicate cusp of a trefoil. These templates were the physical translation of the geometric idea. They were the language through which the master mason communicated his precise intentions to the dozens of other masons working under his direction. A junior mason would take a template for a particular stone to the workshop, or lodge, where the banker masons worked. These were the masons who shaped the rough-hewn blocks from the quarry into their final, perfect forms. They would lay the wooden template upon the stone and trace its outline, then, with chisel and mallet, carefully work the stone to the required shape, checking its surface constantly with a straight edge. The master mason's original line, incised in the plaster of the tracing floor, was thus replicated, again and again, in 1,000 individual pieces of stone, each one a component of a vast, interlocking puzzle. The master mason was the sole keeper of the key to this puzzle, ensuring that every single piece, cut by many different hands, would fit together with absolute precision. But this act of design was inseparable from his role as an engineer. The Gothic Cathedral was, at its core, a structural problem of immense scale and complexity. The great cathedral did not rise from the earth by sheer force of will. It was not a singular act of creation, but a slow, accretive process, an assembly of 1,000,000 measured decisions and 1,000,000 skilled actions. And at the heart of this process, nestled in the shadow of the rising walls, was a humble, functional structure, often overlooked in the grand narrative of soaring vaults and luminous glass. This was the Mason's Lodge. The lodge, a structure often of a deliberately temporary nature, erected from rough-hewn timber and roofed with thatch or wooden shingles, represented not an afterthought, but the very nerve center of the entire construction enterprise. It was here, within these prosaic confines, that raw stone was transmuted into architectural language, that raw youth was forged into skilled craftsmanship, and that a disparate group of itinerant workers was bound into a coherent, self-governing society. The lodge was simultaneously a workshop, a school, a guild hall, and a sanctuary from the relentless wind and rain that swept across the building site. Upon entering the lodge, the first sensation would be the air itself, thick with the fine, pale dust of limestone or sandstone, a powder that coated every surface and filled the lungs with the scent of the earth. The dominant sound was not the clang of a forge or the cry of a foreman, but the rhythmic, percussive music of creation, the sharp tap of the tracer's mallet on his chisel, the abrasive scrape of a drag tool across a stone face, the low murmur of conversation as one craftsman consulted with another. Light, a precious commodity, filtered in through unglazed window openings, often covered with oiled linen or shutters in foul weather, illuminating the space in soft, diffuse shafts. The floor, of packed earth or rough-laid planks, was a tapestry of stone chips, wood shavings, and discarded templates. This was not a space of comfort, but of profound and concentrated purpose. The internal geography of the lodge was dictated by function and hierarchy. A significant area was given over to the bankers, the long, sturdy wooden benches upon which the Freemasons, the skilled hewers of stone, performed their meticulous work. Each mason had his designated space, his tools laid out in a precise and personal order: the heavy axe for rough shaping, the drove and mallet for leveling surfaces, the claw tool for dressing, and a graded series of chisels for the finest details of molding and carving. Close by, another area would be reserved for the setters, or layers, the masons who would eventually place the finished stones into the growing structure. Here, they would mix their lime mortar, checking its consistency, ensuring it was free of impurities, a critical task upon which the stability of the entire edifice depended. Perhaps the most significant feature of the lodge, its sanctum sanctorum, was the tracing floor. This was a large, perfectly flat and smooth surface, often a dedicated section of the floor coated in a fine layer of plaster of Paris. Here the master mason, the magister operis, practiced the high art of his trade. With his large compasses, his straight edge, and his set square, he would draw out the complex geometrical constructions for the cathedral's components, not in miniature, but at full scale. Here, a full-size cross-section of a pier might be drawn, or the intricate pattern of a tracery window, or the precise curvature of a vault rib. These drawings were the source code of the cathedral. From these meticulously drafted lines, thin templates, usually made of wood or sometimes sheet metal, were cut. These templates were the physical embodiment of the master's design, the crucial link between the two-dimensional plan and the three-dimensional stone. The construction of a Gothic cathedral was not an event but a process, a slow, geological accretion of stone and human effort. Within this centuries-long endeavor, the life of a single mason was but a chapter, a distinct and formally structured journey from untutored youth to skilled practitioner. This progression, from apprentice to journeyman, was the fundamental mechanism by which knowledge was preserved and transmitted, the very engine of the cathedral's slow, inexorable rise. It was a lifetime of labor, defined not by dramatic leaps, but by the patient, iterative mastery of stone. The journey commenced in youth, typically around the age of 12 or 14, formalized not by a simple agreement but by a binding legal indenture. This document, a contract between the boy's family and a master mason, would dictate the course of the next 7 years. In exchange for loyalty, obedience, and unwavering, unpaid labor, the master pledged to provide lodging, sustenance, and, most critically, the secrets of the craft. The boy would enter the master's household, becoming a part of his domestic and professional life. His former identity would begin to recede, replaced by his new role within the highly structured world of the builder's lodge. The first years of apprenticeship were an exercise in humility and observation. The boy was the lowest member of the worksite hierarchy. His tasks were menial, yet essential. He would be the one to fetch water, to carry messages, to sweep the stone dust and chippings from the floor of the mason's lodge. His hands, not yet trusted with a fine chisel, would learn the weight of stone by hauling smaller blocks, the rough texture of the unfinished quarry-face material abrading his skin. He would learn the alchemy of mortar, mixing precise ratios of sand, water, and slaked lime. He would spend countless hours turning the grindstone, its rhythmic, scraping sound a constant auditory backdrop to the site, as journeymen and the master himself brought their precious iron tools to be honed. The apprentice learned the feel of a perfectly sharpened edge, the way it caught the light long before he was permitted to use it with any purpose. This period was a deep, sensory immersion. The air in the lodge was perpetually hazed with a fine white dust that settled on every surface and filled the lungs. The dominant sound was the percussive symphony of iron on stone, the sharp tick of a fine chisel on a finishing surface, the duller thud of a heavy maul splitting a larger block, the continuous chip, chip, chip of dozens of masons working in silent concentration. He learned to distinguish the different types of stone not by name alone, but by their character under the tool. The soft, yielding nature of a fine-grained limestone, the stubborn, crystalline resistance of granite, the particular way a piece of sandstone would crumble if struck against its sedimentary bed. As the years passed, typically by the 3rd or 4th year, the apprentice's role would subtly shift. He would be allowed his first tools, often simple and heavy, a point chisel for rough shaping, a heavy mallet or maul. His first task would not be to create, but to destroy with purpose. He would be set to work on a rough block of stone, with the sole instruction to make one face perfectly flat and true. This was the fundamental skill upon which all others were built. Day after day, he would work on this single problem. He learned to use the plumb rule to check for vertical, the straight edge to find the high spots. He learned the specific angle at which to hold the chisel, the precise weight of the mallet blow needed to remove a flake of stone without stunning or fracturing the mass beneath. It was a painstaking, repetitive process. His hands would ache, his arms would grow strong, and his mind would slowly internalize the deep, physical logic of the material. From the flat plane, he would progress to the square. Within the vast, cool silence of the Gothic Cathedral, the eye is drawn upwards, following the soaring lines of the clustered columns, the intricate tracery of the windows, the complex fan of the rib vault. We perceive the whole, the monumental and unified expression of faith and engineering. Yet, concealed in plain sight, on the surface of countless individual stones, is a far more intimate story. It is a story told in small, incised symbols, a vernacular script of the medieval artisan. This is the mason's mark, a quiet signature in stone. To the casual observer, these marks may appear as random scratches, the graffiti of a bygone age. But to the architectural historian, they are a vital clue, a system of identification and accounting that unlocks the complex human machinery behind the cathedral's construction. Each mark, a simple geometric sign, a letter, or a unique device, connects a specific block of stone to the hand that shaped it. It is the fundamental unit of a system of slow finance and quality control, a system essential for a project that might span generations. Let us examine the mark itself in its most elemental form. It is not a flourish of artistic pride, not an elaborate carving. It is, by design, simple and swift to execute. Using the corner of a chisel or a specialized punch, the mason would strike a shallow inscription into the dressed face of the stone he had just finished. The shapes were rudimentary and easily distinguishable. A simple cross, an arrow, an hourglass, a trident, a looped figure eight, a W, an inverted V. These were not letters in the conventional sense, as literacy was far from universal among the craftsmen. Rather, they were abstract symbols, a personal sigil, assigned to or chosen by an individual mason upon achieving the status of a journeyman. This mark would be his and his alone for the duration of his work at that particular construction site, or loge. The primary function of this mark, the one upon which most scholars agree, was logistical and economic. Cathedral construction was not a salaried enterprise in the modern sense. Most of the skilled banker masons, the men who worked at a bench or bank to shape the rough-hewn blocks into precise ashlars and complex voussoirs, were paid by the piece. The scale of the operation was immense. A single cathedral could require hundreds of thousands of dressed stones. A system was needed to track the output of each individual mason. The mark provided this system. Once a mason completed a stone, dressing it to the exact specifications of the wooden templates provided by the master mason, he would chisel his personal mark onto its face. This block would then be presented to the warden or the master of works for inspection. The master would check the stone's dimensions, the trueness of its angles, the quality of its finish. If it met the high standards required, it was accepted. The mark identified the creator, and a tally was made. At the end of the week or the fortnight, the mason would be paid based on the number of accepted stones bearing his mark. If a stone was found to be defective, the mark ensured the master mason knew who was responsible for the error, and the cost of the wasted material and labor could be accounted for. The mark, therefore, was a tool of accountability, a linchpin in the slow, meticulous process of medieval finance, ensuring that funds, often gathered over decades from donations, tithes, and taxes, were spent with careful oversight. The journey of the marked stone did not end at the inspection point. From the mason's bench, the stone was moved by laborers to the base of the rising walls. Here, another group of craftsmen, the setter masons or layers, would take over. Their job was to fit the stones into place, using lime mortar as a binding agent. It is here that we encounter another layer of complexity in the language of marks. The Gothic Cathedral, a testament to faith, rendered in stone and glass, rises from the earth not by prayer alone. Its construction and endeavor spanning generations demanded a financial apparatus as complex and sophisticated as its architectural design. The soaring vaults and intricate tracery, the very fabric of these monumental structures, were underwritten by a slow, deliberate, and multifaceted economic system. This system, a confluence of obligation, devotion, and transaction, drew its strength from three primary currents of revenue: the foundational tithe, the charismatic power of relics, and the systematized sale of indulgences. To understand the cathedral, one must first understand the methods by which each stone was purchased and each artisan paid. We begin with the most ancient and dependable of these streams, the tithe. The tithe, or decima pars, the 10th part, was the bedrock of ecclesiastical finance. Its roots lay deep in biblical precedent, an ancient obligation institutionalized and codified into secular law by rulers such as Charlemagne in the late 8th century. It was not a voluntary donation, but a compulsory tax levied upon the agricultural produce of the land. For the vast majority of the medieval population, whose wealth was not in coin but in the yield of the fields and the increase of their herds, the tithe was an annual reality. It was paid in kind. At harvest time, every 10th sheaf of wheat, barley, or rye was set aside for the church. Every 10th lamb, calf, or piglet was marked as ecclesiastical property. Vats of wine, measures of olive oil, baskets of fruit, all flowed from the parishioner to the parish. This consistent, if seasonally variable, influx of goods necessitated a specific architectural form, the tithe barn. These structures, often immense in scale and built with a quality of craftsmanship rivaling that of the local church, were essentially warehouses for the material manifestation of faith-based taxation. Within their cavernous interiors, the wealth of the diocese was gathered, stored, and processed. The great cruck frames and stone walls of a tithe barn stand as silent witnesses to an economy where grain was as vital as gold. The revenue generated by the tithe was, in theory, subject to a quadripartite division. One quarter was allocated to the bishop for the administration of the diocese and the maintenance of his own household and duties. One quarter was designated for the support of the local parish clergy. A third quarter was intended for the relief of the poor and the destitute within the parish. And the final quarter was dedicated to the fabric, the physical maintenance and repair of church buildings. It was from the bishop's portion, and the portion allocated to the fabric of the cathedral church itself, that the slow, methodical work of construction and repair was primarily funded. The tithe paid for the mortar, for the replacement of a worn step, for the wages of the resident craftsmen who maintained the structure. However, its flow was predictable and relatively modest. It was the revenue of maintenance, not of grand ambition. It could sustain a project, but it could rarely launch one. For the vast capital expenditures required to quarry 1,000 tons of limestone, to raise a new nave, or to cast a great bell, the church required more dynamic sources of income. This need was met by the spiritual economy of relics. A relic, the physical remnant of a saint or an object with which they had direct contact, was more than an object of veneration. It was a spiritual magnet, an engine of commerce that drew pilgrims and their money from across Christendom. The theological underpinning was the belief in the intercession of saints. The saint, being in heaven, could plead a supplicant's case directly to God. The relic, a physical link to that saint on earth, was a focal point for this process, a conduit of sacred power. Relics were categorized with scholastic precision. We have spoken of stone, of its journey from the deep earth to the mason's bench. We have examined the intricate social structures of the guilds, the hierarchies of skill that translated raw material into sublime form. But stone is inert, and hands, however skilled, require direction. They require payment. The slow, century-spanning process of Gothic cathedral construction was, above all else, an act of will, an exercise in sustained intention. To understand the cathedral, we must therefore turn from the quarry and the lodge to the palace and the episcopal see. we must examine the complex tapestry of patronage and politics, the interwoven ambitions of the two great powers of the medieval world, the king and the bishop. The primary impetus for the construction of a new cathedral almost invariably originated with the bishop. The cathedral was, by definition, his church, the site of his cathedra or ceremonial throne. It was the administrative and spiritual heart of his diocese. A grander, more modern cathedral was a direct reflection of the bishop's own power, piety, and prestige. A crumbling Romanesque predecessor was not merely an architectural issue. It was a statement of spiritual and temporal weakness, an invitation for challenges from local secular lords or rival ecclesiastics. The decision to build, therefore, was a profound political act. The bishop, as the project's chief executive, commanded a range of financial instruments. The most fundamental of these was the tithe, the 10% levy on the agricultural and commercial product of the diocese. While a constant source of revenue, the tithe was often insufficient for the immense capital expenditure a new cathedral demanded. It was a stream for maintenance, not a flood for construction. Therefore, the bishop's personal wealth, derived from the vast agricultural estates attached to the episcopal see, was often pledged. These lands, the church's patrimony, were managed as productive enterprises, their yields of grain, wool, and wine converted into the currency that paid the master mason and his crews. Beyond these foundational revenues, the bishop employed more targeted fundraising mechanisms. One of the most effective was the promotion of a cult of relics. The possession of a significant holy relic, the bone of an apostle, a fragment of the true cross, the tunic of a local saint, transformed a church from a local administrative center into a regional, or even international, pilgrimage destination. Pilgrims brought with them not only their piety but their coin. They made offerings at the shrine, purchased devotional objects, and spent money on food and lodging within the city, a portion of which would find its way back to the cathedral chapter through taxes and rents. The bishop and his canons would organize processions, display the relic on special feast days, and actively publicize the miracles attributed to its presence. The construction of a magnificent new structure to house such a relic was, in itself, an act of promotion, a way of signaling the relic's importance and attracting yet more pilgrims in a self-perpetuating cycle of revenue generation. Furthermore, the episcopate controlled the powerful spiritual tool of the indulgence. An indulgence was the remission of temporal punishment and purgatory due for sins. Bishops, with papal authority, could grant indulgences to those who contributed alms to the cathedral building fund. A donation, therefore, became not merely an act of civic pride or piety, but a direct investment in the salvation of one's soul. Fundraising tours would be organized, where a preacher, sometimes accompanied by a minor relic, would travel from town to town within the diocese, offering indulgences in exchange for contributions, however small. The accumulated donations from thousands of ordinary faithful, each seeking to shorten their time in purgatory, formed a significant, if fluctuating, source of income. We have thus far examined the raw materials of cathedral construction, the stone hewn from the earth and the timber from the forest. We have explored the organizational structures of the Mason's Lodge, a world unto itself, governed by secret knowledge and hierarchical discipline. But a cathedral is more than its constituent parts, more than the sum of its stones and the skill of its builders. It is a manifestation of will, a monumental expression of collective purpose. And in the High Middle Ages, a crucial shift occurred in the nature of that will. The impetus for these great works began to move away from the exclusive domain of monarchs and powerful prince-bishops and into a new dynamic arena, the burgeoning medieval city. This chapter concerns the rise of the Citizens' Cathedral, a project underwritten not by royal decree, but by the complex interplay of civic pride and the accumulated wealth of a new and powerful merchant class. To understand this transition, we must first understand the changing landscape of 12th and 13th century Europe. The old feudal order, a rigid pyramid of obligation with the king at its apex, was being challenged by the rapid growth of urban centers. These were places of commerce, of craft, of nascent capitalism. Cities like Florence, Ghent, Bruges, and Cologne were becoming powerful economic engines, their fortunes built on textiles, trade routes, banking, and specialized crafts. As their wealth grew, so did their desire for autonomy. They negotiated or fought for charters of liberty from feudal lords, establishing their own councils, laws, and systems of taxation. With this newfound self-governance came a powerful new sense of collective identity. The inhabitants began to see themselves not merely as subjects of a distant king, but as citizens of a particular city. They were Florentines, or Parisians, or Londoners. And every great city, to prove its greatness, required a great cathedral. The cathedral became the ultimate physical expression of the city's identity and ambition. It was the city's heart, its most prominent landmark, a testament in stone and glass to its success and its piety. A fierce, unspoken, and sometimes spoken rivalry emerged between cities. This was not a competition of armies, but of architecture. The driving question became who could build higher, wider, and more gloriously. When the citizens of Siena decided to rebuild their cathedral in the early 14th century, their stated plan was to turn the existing magnificent structure into a mere transept for a new, impossibly vast basilica that would dwarf that of their bitter rival, Florence. The project, ultimately doomed by structural problems and the arrival of the Black Death, is a stark example of the scale of this civic ambition. Similarly, the construction of the cathedral at Beauvais in France was a direct attempt to exceed the height of the nave at Amiens. The Beauvais choir, soaring to a record 48 meters, was the marvel of Christendom until its partial collapse in 1284, a catastrophic but telling failure born of audacious civic pride. This pride was the psychological fuel, but the engine of construction was the new urban wealth. The slow, patient financing of a Gothic cathedral was a complex tapestry woven from countless threads of capital. The primary source was no longer a single, wealthy patron like a king, but a broad base of donors, each contributing for a mixture of sacred and secular reasons. At the forefront of this new model of patronage were the merchant guilds. The guilds were the central organizing principle of the medieval city's economic and social life. The weavers, the dyers, the furriers, the goldsmiths, the bakers, the vintners, each profession had its guild, which regulated quality, training, and prices. These institutions accumulated immense collective wealth, and they sought ways to display it that would confer both spiritual merit and social prestige. The popular imagination conceives of the Gothic cathedral as an act of singular, unified creation, a singular vision, executed with relentless piety over decades. The reality, however, was a far more fragmented and precarious affair, governed not by a smooth continuum of progress, but by the unpredictable ebb and flow of capital. This was the era of slow finance, an economic ecosystem as intricate and as vulnerable as the delicate stone tracery of a clerestory window. When the money ran out, the silence that fell over the construction site was a profound and defining feature of the medieval building experience. The financial lifeblood of a cathedral project was a complex circulatory system, fed by numerous, often unreliable tributaries. The initial impetus might come from the great wealth of a bishop or a monarch, a grand gesture of patronage meant to secure their legacy in both the temporal and spiritual realms. This munificence, however, was rarely sufficient to see a project through its entire, century-spanning lifespan. The cathedral chapter, the administrative body of canons, would commit its own revenues, derived from vast agricultural landholdings, tithes, and urban properties. These incomes were themselves subject to the vicissitudes of harvest, weather, and local economic health. A poor yield of wheat in the fields of the Ile-de-France could directly translate into a slowing of work on the rising Nave of Chartres. To supplement these core funds, a sophisticated and persistent fundraising apparatus was required. Donations were solicited from the burgeoning merchant classes, who saw in the cathedral a vessel for their civic pride and a means of spiritual insurance. Wills and bequests were a crucial source of income, with the dying leaving land, coin, or valuables to the fabrica, the building fund, in the hope of shortening their time in purgatory. The cult of saints and relics provided yet another stream. The presence of a particularly potent relic could draw thousands of pilgrims, whose small offerings, when aggregated, formed a significant sum. Finally, and perhaps most contentiously, there was the sale of indulgences, promises of remission of sin in exchange for a contribution to the holy work. Each of these streams was fickle. A war could divert royal and noble patronage. A new, more popular shrine in a neighboring diocese could siphon away pilgrims. A theological dispute could undermine the very authority to grant indulgences. The financial foundation of a cathedral was not solid bedrock, but a constantly shifting alluvial plain. The interruption, when it came, was seldom abrupt. It was a gradual strangulation. The master of the works, the magister operis, would first notice it in the diminishing weight of the coin chests. The regular flow of silver pennies from the chapter's exchequer would become sporadic. He would be forced to make difficult decisions. Perhaps the purchase of a new shipment of lead for the temporary roofing of an aisle would be deferred. Perhaps the hiring of supplementary, less skilled laborers for excavation work would be halted. The primary objective became the retention of the core group of master craftsmen, the Freemasons who carved the intricate moldings, the carpenters who built the complex centering for the vaults, the glaziers who were planning the great rose windows. These men represented the project's institutional memory and its most valuable human capital. Losing them meant losing the continuity of the design, the unique skills honed over years on that specific site. But as the financial drought continued, even these measures became insufficient. The master mason would have to inform his guild brethren that their weekly wages could no longer be guaranteed. One by one, the artisans would pack their mallets, chisels, and squares. They were itinerant by nature, their allegiance tied to the promise of steady work. The stone skeleton of the cathedral, a monumental achievement of the master mason and his lodge, was never the complete vision. It was the armature, the vast and silent framework, upon which a chorus of other crafts would apply their own specialized knowledge. The construction site, the fabrica, was not merely a quarry transposed, but a complex, interdependent ecosystem of workshops and skilled hands. Here, the percussive ring of the mason's chisel was but one note in a much larger, slower symphony. To understand the finished Gothic edifice is to understand this collaboration, this quiet convergence of disparate arts, each contributing a vital layer to the whole. We turn now from the structural stone to the crafts that clothed it, that gave it voice and light, the glaziers, the carpenters, and the sculptors. The glazier's art began not with light, but with fire and sand. In forest workshops, far from the cathedral site, glass was produced through one of two laborious methods. The cylinder, or muff, process involved the glass blower creating a long, cylindrical bubble, slicing off the ends, and then cutting the cylinder lengthwise. This piece was then placed in a secondary furnace, where it was carefully unrolled and flattened into a sheet. The alternative, the crown process, began with a bubble of molten glass, which was then transferred from the blowpipe to a solid iron rod, or pontil. By spinning the pontil rapidly, centrifugal force would flatten the bubble into a large, circular disc, thickest at the central pontil mark, known as the bullseye, and progressively thinner toward the edges. Each method produced a glass of unique character, filled with imperfections, seeds of trapped air, striations from the flattening process, and subtle waves on its surface. These were not seen as flaws, but as integral qualities that would later refract and soften the incoming light, making it dance and shimmer in a way that modern, uniform plate glass cannot replicate. The vibrant color, the very soul of a Gothic window, was achieved by adding metallic oxides to the molten silica mix. A small amount of cobalt oxide yielded a deep, resonant blue, the iconic blue of Chartres. Copper oxide, in a carefully controlled, oxygen-poor furnace environment, produced a rich ruby red, a notoriously difficult color to create and control. Manganese could produce purples, or if added to an iron-rich sand mixture, It would neutralize the inherent greenish tint to create a seemingly clear glass. These colored sheets, uneven in thickness and inconsistent in hue, were then packed in straw and transported by cart to the glazier's workshop at the cathedral. Here, the master glazier would begin with the cartoon, a full-scale design drawn onto a large, whitewashed wooden table. Every detail of the final window was present on this drawing, including the crucial dark lines indicating the placement of the lead channels, or cames. Pieces of colored glass, chosen for their specific hue and texture, were laid over their corresponding shapes on the cartoon. The glazier would then cut each piece, not with a diamond, but with a heated grozing iron. By drawing the hot iron tip across the glass, a line of thermal stress was created, allowing the glazier to snap the glass along the desired line. Fine adjustments to the shape were made by nibbling away at the edges with a notch tool, also called a grozer. Once all the pieces were cut and fitted, the painterly details were applied. This was not painting in the conventional sense, but the application of a vitreous paint known as grisaille. This was a dark, reddish-brown or a black compound made of ground copper or iron oxide mixed with powdered glass and a binder, such as wine, vinegar, or even urine. Using fine brushes, the artist would paint faces, hands, the folds of drapery, and other linear details directly onto the inner surface of the glass pieces. Lighter washes of the same mixture could be used for shading. We perceive the Gothic Cathedral as a terminal object, a silent monolith of stone and glass that has arrived at the end of its history. We walk its aisles, our footsteps echoing in the cavernous vaults, and we see it as a destination, a relic of a distant, monolithic faith. But this perspective, however common, is a profound misreading of the evidence. The cathedral was not an endpoint, it was a catalyst. Its true legacy is not inscribed in the final stone placed upon its spire, but in the vast and intricate web of change it precipitated across the medieval world. To understand the cathedral is to understand it not as a static object but as a dynamic process, an engine of societal, economic, and intellectual transformation that remade Europe from the quarry floor to the highest echelons of philosophic thought. The most immediate and quantifiable legacy was economic. A cathedral was the single largest and most complex industrial undertaking of its age, a project of a scale not seen in Europe since the construction of the Roman aqueducts. It functioned as a black hole for capital, drawing in wealth from an astonishingly diverse array of sources. Tithes, of course, formed the bedrock of its financing, the compulsory 10% of agricultural and artisanal product flowing into the diocesan coffers. But this was merely the foundation. Added to it were the vast revenues from church-owned lands, bequests from wealthy nobles seeking to smooth their path to the afterlife, and the sale of indulgences, a spiritual transaction that converted the fear of purgatory into tangible silver deniers. Pilgrimage was another critical revenue stream. The possession of a significant holy relic, the bone of a saint, a fragment of the true cross, could turn a regional church into an international destination, bringing with it a steady flow of pilgrims whose donations, however small individually, collectively amounted to a fortune. This constant multi-generational influx of capital created what we might term a proto-industrial economy in the heart of the feudal landscape. The cathedral construction site, the Fabrica, became the epicenter of this new economy. It was one of the first contexts in the medieval period for large-scale, long-term wage labor. The feudal system was predicated on obligation and land tenure, but one could not build a Chartres or a Canterbury on serfdom. The skills required were too specialized, the labor too sustained, and so a new class of professional artisan emerged: the master mason, the journeyman, the quarryman, the carpenter, the glazier, the lead worker, the blacksmith. These men were not tied to a lord's land. They were mobile, traveling from one great project to the next, following the demand for their expertise. They were paid in cash, a novelty that injected liquidity into local economies. The payroll for a major cathedral could involve hundreds of men, each receiving a daily or weekly wage commensurate with their skill level. This necessitated complex accounting. The clerk of the works, a nascent project manager, kept meticulous records on parchment rolls, tracking expenditures on stone, timber, lead, wages, food, and tools. These account books, some of which survive, are invaluable documents, revealing a world of standardized measures, contractual agreements, and sophisticated financial planning that fundamentally contradicts the popular image of a primitive and unsophisticated age. The logistical chains required to supply the fabrica were equally transformative. Stone, the very essence of the cathedral, had to be sourced and transported with immense care. The finest limestone, like that from Caen in Normandy, was prized for its fine grain and resistance to frost. It was quarried in massive blocks, roughly dressed on site to reduce weight, and then loaded onto barges to be shipped across the English Channel and upriver. The hammers are silent now. The dust of ages has settled. The great stone cathedrals sleep, a testament to slow, patient work. Thank you for joining us on The Whispered Lore. As the great work of your day is done, let the quiet weight of their legacy bring you peace. Let the echoes of the chisel fade as you drift into your own deep and quiet rest. Good night. Rest well.